Good evening, New York 14. My name is Miriam Jalul, and I'm the Legislative Director for the Office of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you for joining our monthly town hall. Just a few notes of housekeeping. If you are logged into the Zoom meeting, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Please mention what neighborhood or city you're from, as we prioritize questions from constituents. Alternatively, you can email your questions to aoc.townhall@mail.house.gov or call 718-662-5970. Our staff is also available to support with any technical difficulties. Our team members will be monitoring the inbox and phone. We are also live on Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's YouTube channel, so please feel free to visit our YouTube page for the live stream. CART Open Captions is being provided by All Hands in Motion. If you click the link in the chat, it will take you to a website where you can view the transcription. For today's town hall, we will hear an update from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. We will then open it up for a Q&A from constituents. After the Q&A, there will be a press gaggle where members of the press will be able to pose questions. And now I'd like to introduce you to your Congresswoman, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, to give instructions in Spanish on how to submit questions and access CART Open Captions. After this, she will provide her updates.
Thank you so much, Miriam. We so appreciate you taking the turn in hosting and emceeing our town hall, our digital town hall this month. También si estás con nosotros y quieres ayuda en español, ahí estás aquí en Zoom, por favor, haga clic en el botón de lenguajes en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccione Spanish o español para acceder el audio en español. También puede someter su pregunta escrita en español por medio del chat. Y si está llamando por teléfono y le gustaría hacer una pregunta, por favor, envía un mensaje de correo electrónico a aoc.townhall@mail.house.gov o llame a 718-662-5970. Gracias. All right, so thank you everyone so much. I'm going to just dive in chronologically into what this past month's legislative work has brought us. I'm going to try to move through our updates and then leave our questions as much time as we can for our Q&A. So first things that we were up to this month was that we reintroduced our bill to create our postal banking pilot program. Right now, 63 million people in the United States don't have access to basic banking, check cashing, services without often and many times huge fees. Post offices already exist in underbanked areas and could fill the gap. For example, I live in Parkchester, and Parkchester is a quite underbanked community. We have branches here and there, but when you compare the amount of people per capita, or rather when you compare per capita how many people each branch serves, it's much higher than normal. So anyone who lives in a community like Parkchester or many others throughout the district can tell you that when you go to the bank, sometimes the lines can be really, really long, can last a very, very long time. And so there are many banks and communities like these across the country. And what postal banking would do, and what this pilot project does, is that it authorizes several $1 million to launch postal banking pilot programs, which would allow fee-free ATMs, as well as check cashing and other very basic non-banked, you can't open a savings account, but you can do basic transactions at the post office, which would just simply allow another option to engage in basic banking services. So we're very excited. We are working on this project with Senator Gillibrand, as well as Marcy Kaptur and Jonathan Pascrell in the House. Bill Pascrell, my mistake. Next, one of the things that we really saw in a very concerning development for many of our constituents was the outbreak of violent crackdowns in Colombia in response to protests against really civilian and everyday people in Colombia, led protests against a suite of laws that essentially cracked down and targeted the working class and the poor. What we saw was essentially just really disproportionate increases that were completely unsustainable in taxes on poor and working people in Colombia. As a result, on May Day, there were many protests that people started to kind of come out in opposition and use their ability to demonstrate and to organize to protest against these laws, which then resulted in an extremely violent crackdown by the government in Colombia on workers and everyday people that were protesting. This development has been extremely concerning and has resulted in the killing of many protesters. And so what we really started to see in our community is that our community, for those of you who may have joined or even saw, there was a very large gathering in Jackson Heights where our Colombian community really organizes and rallies around. And what we did was that we wrote to Secretary Blinken for the US to play a role in active de-escalation in the region and foster dialogue with national organizers. We also asked for the United States to condition aid to no longer abet police brutality and human rights abuses. The United States has something known as leahy laws, and it is illegal for the United States to provide military aid to governments that are violating human rights. And one of the tricky things is that leahy laws and the enforcement of leahy laws is not always even, and it should be. It should be. And so this is a value that we have, and it's one that we wanted to make sure, especially because in the case of Colombia, the United States was providing armaments into a regime that was clearly and continues to be clearly engaged in the suppression of people's right to free speech. And so we wanted to make sure that we were responsive to our community in this field. And then moving on to our next topic, in a similar vein, I introduced, along with Senator Bernie Sanders last week, a joint resolution to similarly express disapproval in the United States targeted weapons sale to the government of Israel. It was submitted, it was a historic resolution, HRES 49, with 14 original co-sponsors on it. The United States has sold billions of dollars in weaponry while Palestinian human rights continue to be violated. And similarly to what we saw with our community rallying around the human rights conditions in Colombia, for those of you who were around Sunnyside, Queens this weekend, you saw thousands and thousands of our constituents rallying for the protection of and the assurance for the United States to use its role in protecting Palestinian human rights. Now, I think it goes without saying, and it must be said, that the United States is playing a role. And I frankly, very strongly disagreed with the Biden administration's approach in this, given the urgency of the situation. Over 200 people have passed away and were killed in these strikes. Over 200 of them were Palestinian. We also had an absolutely unacceptable loss of life and killing of Israelis. And we know that Hamas targeting of civilian targets is wrong and is a crime. U.S. aid is going to the targeting of Palestinian civilian targets. And that's where I think we need to draw a line. And so with a lot of that activism and a lot of that organizing in our own community with our constituents, calling, mobilizing, etc. We introduced this resolution. And once again, Senator Sanders is carrying the companion legislation in the Senate. The ceasefire and the development of a ceasefire is a welcome development. It's an important development, but it is not enough because it does not address the actual ongoing dehumanizing conditions that are leading and rather contributing to the outbreak of violence. And so we must continue to do work in this region. We must continue to center the protection of human rights, the human rights of Palestinians and Israelis alike, but we must also acknowledge the asymmetry in this situation and acknowledge the most vulnerable, which we have seen played out over the last several weeks of this crisis. And on that other note, I think it's extremely important that we address the absolutely disturbing and horrifying outbreak in anti-Semitic violence that we have seen, not just in New York City, but where we've seen it beyond New York City. And I want to make something really very clear, which is that anti-Semitism is bigotry, it is hatred, it is disgusting, and it is antithetical to everything that our community stands for. We must stand with our Jewish community, our Jewish community in supporting and protecting them, along with all of our other communities against hate crimes and violence. And this is not just about physical violence, but this is about verbal assault and confrontation. And we have heard this from just resoundingly across the board. No matter who you are, no matter where you're from, this is not welcome here. And particularly from our Palestinian organizers and leaders, they have also made it extremely clear that anti-Semitism is not welcome anywhere in this conversation. Not only is it not welcome, but frankly, if you are an anti-Semite walking through these streets, you are hurting everybody. You're not for any cause. You're not advancing any humanitarian goal. You're just a bigot, and bigots are not welcome in this city. And I can certainly tell you that they are not welcome in our congressional district. But there is something that our community can do, and I want to bring that to all of your attention. Is that the city provides free bystander intervention training, and we're happy to send out that link with you all. This is bystander intervention training is really wonderful in increasing your confidence and your ability to safely intervene in situations of discriminatory targeting and help keep our neighbors safe. The city made this bystander training free. It is 1 hour. We can share that link with you, but we will never, ever, ever accept racism, bigotry, homophobia, anti-Semitism, or any form of discrimination in our district and anywhere in the world, frankly. So it's very important that we stand together as a community and show that that we can stand for human rights and that we must stand for all human rights. Because without it, then it's just simply a cause that lacks integrity. And we know that the cause of human rights is one that is of utmost integrity and consistency.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And we have dropped the link to that in the chat for all of us, for everyone who's joining us on Zoom.
Okay. Next up on other legislation that we have introduced this month, we added an amendment very recently and passed it in the House, an amendment that bans what is known as zombie debt collection. So, right now, debt collectors, they trick a lot of consumers. They could be tricking you at home into reviving dead debts. There are certain debts that are known as dead debts for one reason or another. They have become ineligible for collection. And there are many debt collectors out there that trick people into taking these debts that are ineligible for collection and reviving them. And it has been an awful, awful practice. And it's one that we have introduced an amendment to larger pieces of financial services legislation in the House to ban this practice. So hopefully, if you happen to be in this situation, you will no longer be targeted for reviving ineligible debt that's ineligible for collection very soon. Again, it has passed the House, and we will let you know if or when it passes the Senate and President Biden's desk. Next, we have the Andrew Kearse Accountability for Denial of Medical Care Act. This is directly related to the case of Andrew Kearse, who is from right here in the Bronx. And we reintroduced this legislation with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, as well as Congressman Espaillat and Senator Warren. Andrew Kearse was a Bronx community member right here from our own community. And he passed away in police custody after he was asking for urgent medical attention. He was denied it, and he passed away. And he was refused an ambulance. He was refused the medical care that he was needed until it was far, far too late. So this legislation holds officers liable for denying medical care to people in custody when they make extremely clear that they are in medical crisis. And that is the bulk of our legislative updates and work from this month. And we are going to head straight to the Q&A.
Thank you for your update, Congresswoman. We will now move to the Q&A portion of our town hall. As mentioned earlier, please mention if you're a constituent signed into the Zoom, mention what neighborhood or city that you're from, as we do prioritize questions coming in from constituents. And also remember that you may write your question in Spanish. Also, a reminder to the members of the press that after the Q&A, there will be a press gaggle where you will be able to pose your questions. So our first question is from Janet from Sunnyside, Paul from Corona, and Megan from Jackson Heights. They all ask questions about student loan forgiveness. And so their question is, could you provide an update on that?
Yes, so I think we have some movement. We do have an update. It may not be the biggest update in the world, but I do think it's a very important update. And the important update is that President Biden has asked the Department of Education to issue a review on his legal authority to cancel student debt. Now, let me explain to you why this is significant and why it's important. One is that President Biden has been historically quite resistant to student debt cancellation. And it has been an issue that we have stayed on him for, both as a member of Congress and from the Progressive Caucus. Senator Warren has very much been leading on this issue. But also, I cannot tell you how important your calls, your advocacy, your organizing, your amplification online and on social media has been to advancing this cause. And so please continue doing it. If you've already sent out the retweets, if you've already added somebody, try making a call, try writing a letter to the White House. I'm telling you, it works. I know sometimes it feels like you're just sending it off into a black hole, but it is important and it is influential. And so what this means is that, as I said, President Biden has historically been quite resistant to the idea of student loan debt cancellation. And for him to go from this position to saying, oh, I don't know if I have the legal authority, or even claiming that he doesn't have the legal authority, to actually directing the Department of Education to telling him and briefing him on what his legal authority is very, very significant, because he's going from kind of dismissing the idea almost outright to actually getting formal documentation that he has the legal authority. And I'm knocking on wood here, but there has been broad consensus that he does in fact have this legal authority. And so he's asking the Department of Education to issue a brief and essentially acknowledge formally in a documented form that he does in fact have, I believe, and I sincerely do believe that they will tell him that he does in fact have the legal authority to cancel student loan debt. And so what does this mean now? Where are we at right now? He has asked the Department of Education to issue this review and brief. And last I checked, I believe that they're in the process of developing that brief and review. And I believe that once the Department of Education comes back, again, knock on wood, but very hopefully saying that he does in fact have the legal authority to cancel student loan debt, he can do it without Congress, with the stroke of his pen. Then once they release that brief, then it's on us to then triple down on our organizing and to get him to do it. He has expressed, some talk around a $10,000 level. I don't think that that's enough. We need to push him. I believe in full student loan debt cancellation, but we have to push him to, at the bare minimum, a floor of $50,000 that Senator Warren and Senator Schumer have also advanced. And $50,000, I believe, would cancel about 80% of the student loan debt in the country. I believe in a higher threshold because, frankly, I believe that our doctors and our lawyers and folks that have been in legal professions, academia, professors, etc. I believe that they should also be eligible to have their student loan debt canceled. And so I think that that's something that's extraordinarily important. I don't believe anybody should be having $300,000, $200,000 in student loan debt. I think it's just completely unconscionable for a nation, particularly that wants to not only advance higher education, but we have to make it financially possible for everyday people so that we can educate our own workforce to the level that the 21st century demands. So that's an update that we have on student loan debt cancellation. Once we find out or get that, once we get any sort of update from the Department of Education on Biden's legal authority, we will be sure to include that in a newsletter so that you all can get calling and to say, well, you have the authority, you have the support, it's enormously popular, so let's do it.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Dan from Sunnyside asks, what can you do to get our police to be reformed and return to being first responders?
So I think it's a great question. And obviously this has been an issue that has been top of mind throughout our community and in debates throughout our community. So one thing that I think is important to discern is that policing budgets, policing issues, by and large, for the most part, are handled at the municipal and state level. So for those who are joining, if this is your first town hall, we've got city officials, like we have our city council, which we will be selecting next month. We have our state assembly and they draft all of our state laws. And then we have the federal level. And as your congresswoman, I operate on the federal level. For a lot of policing reform issues or any sort of budgetary issues, et cetera, the vast majority of those will be handled at the city level and at the state level. But there are some things that we can do and that I can do, and I'll share with you, that we can handle and advocate for on the federal level. So one of the things that we've been kind of discussing, as I mentioned, I introduced legislation on the Andrew Kearse denial, accountability for denying medical care. But I think we have to go beyond that. I think one of the things that we can do on a federal level, which we have joined and amplified on, is banning and really changing our laws around qualified immunity. And what qualified immunity essentially does is that it really grants a lot of this violence that happens in interactions with law enforcement, it allows officers in many, many cases, even cases that in many communities seem very clear-cut, has led to a complete lack of accountability, claiming the clause of qualified immunity. And so in policing legislation that's being debated in the House, such as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the repeal of qualified immunity has been an extremely important negotiating lever. And beyond the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which introduces things like chokehold bans, I think what's important about that is that it's while we are fine to support it, and even in legislation that we're supporting with respect to Andrew Pierce, these are all very small pieces of the situation, right? If you ban a chokehold, that doesn't necessarily stop all police violence, and a lot of times, many of these policing issues, for example, in the case of Eric Garner, chokeholds were banned on the city level, and it happened anyway. So a lot of what we need to do is address a lot of the root causes when it comes to not just policing, but then ultimately, I think what this conversation really is about is safety, community safety, and really our cohesion and again, that safety as a community. And so beyond just looking at community safety strictly from a policing lens, one of the things that I've also done is that we have community funding projects that we are requesting 10 for our district, and we'll provide an update on that perhaps at next town hall or the town hall after. And one of the community funding projects that we have requested has been for a really remarkable program that's being run right out of our district at Jacobi Hospital, and it's called the Stand Up to Violence Program. Now, one thing that we are seeing is that what the Stand Up to Violence Program does is that it started off almost as an experiment at Jacobi Hospital for individuals who are admitted due to being victimized in incidents of violence, whether it's gang violence, domestic violence, etc. And so if you come in admitted with a gunshot wound or a stabbing wound, for example, they bring in not just your medical first response, but your social first response. And so psychiatrists are brought in, social workers are brought in, and the actual lead up to the violent incident is discovered and explored not from a jail, but from the hospital. And what that means is that we bring in a social worker. They'll say what led to this incident. We assess the person's employment situation, their housing situation, as well as bringing in a psychological first response. And whose main goals is to help the person navigate what is obviously and clearly a traumatizing experience. And a main preventer in developing PTSD is having that early intervention, but also reducing the desire for retribution. And one of the things that we have found that the folks at Jacobi Medical Center have discovered is that when you take a public health approach to incidents of violence, they were able to reduce readmission. They were able to reduce the reoccurrence of violence that leads that person to go to the hospital by 59%. 59%. That's immediate. And so when we talk about this larger issue about, public safety is not just about how much money you pump into jails and policing, but public safety is how do you prevent a kid from getting in trouble in the first place? It's about funding schools enough and treating them in a way that they don't constitute a school to prison pipeline. It's about making sure that people are housed in a community, that they're gainfully employed in a community, particularly young people, that we start to see those reductions in crime. And so I just say all of this to encourage us that to encourage the conversation about safety to actually go beyond just a conversation solely about policing. But this is about making sure that communities are invested in and safe and prosperous in the first place, which can really help prevent a lot of violent behavior. And we've seen this. And so I'm extraordinarily proud of our social workers and our doctors and our public health workers at Jacobi Hospital, because this is truly groundbreaking stuff, groundbreaking work. And that is one of the main reasons why we have selected the Stand Up to Violence program as one of our community investment projects to get more investment in expanding this program and resources. And hopefully right here in the Bronx can be the beginning and really a big part of a much larger change across the country in how we approach questions of public safety and policy around public safety.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'm also flagging for our participants that we have included the link to our community project funding request here on Zoom. So feel free to take a look at that, which will include the project that the Congresswoman just indicated. And so our next question is Doug from Woodside, and he is asking, what is the status of the LaGuardia tram through our neighborhoods?
Thank you, Doug, for asking this question. And let me tell you, we hear the community loud and clear that the air train is not welcome. And frankly, I agree with you all. This is not just about not building. This isn't even about just like denying the project. And for context, for those communities that aren't near these impacted communities, or for those of our communities that are hearing about this from the Bronx side, basically, there's been this proposal to introduce an air train to LaGuardia Airport. Not a bad idea in, I think, its overall theory and context. I think it would be really wonderful for us to have increased public transit to LaGuardia. But the problem is the route. I think I may have gone through this in the last town hall, but basically you have LaGuardia here, and let's say you have Manhattan here. Instead of the air train, let's say you take the N or the Q, taking the N of the Q to the N and having an air train go over here. What this air train does is that it charts a path that goes all the way out here and then in and cutting through East Elmhurst, cutting across Flushing Bay, introducing a lot of environmental issues and a lot of disruption. But even, I think also very concerningly is that our goal is to help reduce traffic and get cars off the road where it's possible. And I don't know how a route that is so much longer is going to help encourage people to take public transit. I think folks are definitely willing to add a couple minutes to add some time to their commute if if it means not taking a $40 or $50 cab, but just taking a single ride if you're visiting the city, I guess, or $2 to $5, rather $3 to $5 on the metro, depending on whatever. Anyway, so I think if you're adding that much to your commute, I'm really concerned in the effectiveness of this to begin with. There's been lots of concerns raised from many different stakeholders in the community, from direct residents in the community. This new route is much more disruptive to a lot more people, and as well as environmental concerns that have been brought up by our folks who use Flushing Bay. And Flushing Bay is one of the only green spaces, and it's a really phenomenal green space, I guess blue space you can call it, that communities have access to. And so not only that, but there are many alternatives to the air train that we have asked the FAA to consider, not just from added express bus lanes, but ferry service to LaGuardia, as well as many other alternatives. And the FAA just dismissed them out of hand. It was really not substantiated whatsoever why they rejected 12 different stated alternatives, including building that air train from the subway station to LaGuardia on through Astoria, like taking the end to the very end, and then just starting the air train from there. And so we did not get an adequate response. And then there was an article that recently came out showing that there was some questionable activity behind the very swift dismissal of all these alternatives. So all of this is to say is that in sum, I will be sending a letter likely this week to the FAA, asking them, in light of the new journalism that has come out, showing the kind of questionable circumstances that this project was approved under, to review and to not just rubber stamp this project through, but to actually review those questionable circumstances, and essentially check the Trump administration's work in trying to rush this project through.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Michael from Sunnyside asks, what are your strategies for working with colleagues on the other side of the aisle, many of whom have disagreements beyond just policies? So for example, they're harmful, they're bullies, they're harassing you. Yeah.
Well, I think here's the deal, is that there is a level where you just don't engage. And I must say that it's that I have a pretty high threshold for that. But following me around for years, and trying to like lift up my mail flap and talk through it, that's kind of where I draw the line in not taking you as a serious member of Congress for engagement and collaboration. That being said, I think the dynamics are very interesting in the House right now. I am often able to talk to my Republican colleagues, particularly those on my committee, and discuss issues that we think are of mutual interest, and they do agree. They do exist. Issues like there are some issues. I think that there are some Republicans that actually have a certain degree of openness around marijuana decriminalization, for example. I have recently had discussions with some senior Republicans about this. I've also talked to Republicans about things like composting laws. And sometimes we're able to get some progress on some things. But I will be frank that the dedication and lockstepedness towards Trumpism has made working with the Republican Party quite difficult at times, and I think that we even see this at a higher level. There are Republicans, for example, take the January 6th Commission, for example. There were Republicans that said, hey, we will support this if you make the committee completely bipartisan, for example. Equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans will support this if you meet these demands, if you meet these things, and then we can all come together and pass this legislation on a totally bipartisan basis instead of a straight partisan one. And these accommodations will be made in these negotiations with Democrats trying to engage in good faith. And then the day before the bill's supposed to vote, Republicans pull all support. And, I think that this is this creates, I think, a disincentive to work with Republicans, that they make all of these demands to water down legislation. Then Democrats or certain leaders do that in a good faith effort to try to compromise, and then they pull their support and it ends up getting passed on a partisan basis anyway. And if Republicans are gonna do that, then we might as well pass 100% of what we want and make that maximum progress no matter what. And so I think with certain very banal topics, that kind of work across the aisle can happen. There are also other areas, civil liberties, anti-war. Last session, I was able to get Republican support on my amendment. Ironically, I was able to get some Republican support, but not enough Democratic support in my amendment to decriminalize research into psychoactive compounds. Right now, we have a ban on allowing federal funding of certain research on substances like psilocybin and MDMA. And I actually had certain Republicans who consider themselves libertarian, join me on that. But a lot of Democrats did not join me on that. And so I will keep on the good fight there. But I think there are certain civil liberties areas, certain areas, particularly in oversight of cracking down on corrupt military contracting. We have received certain Republican support on that as well. So there are some very, very, very narrow areas where we can get that support, but they need to make good on their promises when it comes to actual legislative activity.
Thank you. John from Astoria asks, could you please take this opportunity to explain your recent vote of present on the Capitol Security Supplemental Bill?
Yes. So I appreciate this question. This was a very tough vote. And I will let you know what the breakdown on this supplemental is. So on the January 6th attack, on the day of January 6th, as well as in the immediate aftermath of the 6th, there was an extraordinary amount of resources, as you all probably saw on television, that were added and that were used and brought in the day of and in the month and months after. That includes a lot of people working overtime. That includes house custodial staff that you saw cleaning up in the aftermath, including getting personal transport for that custodial staff and all staff in that Capitol, because they did not take the subway system. Those expenses were used to make sure that we could personally transport all those folks. So an enormous proportion of the resources in that bill were going to paying bills that were already incurred, paying people their overtime that they had already worked, not authorizing new overtime per se, but paying folks for the overtime that they had already worked, as well as certain structural changes like hardening the doors and windows in the Capitol. A detail about our work is that there still have been broken windows from that day that staff and people walk past in working in our nation's capital. There's also some funding in there for pop-up fencing. I do not believe in permanent fencing up and around the nation's capital, but this is fencing that I believe exists around the UN and places like the EU, where if in an emergency, it could emerge, and some improvements there. So those were things that I felt, as well as mental health resources for recovery for a lot of individuals for whom that care is not covered. There are areas of this bill that I'm strongly opposed to. One was this authorization under the National Guard of a new quick response force. I think that this is an attempt to try to get around what we saw as a critical failure that day, which was the failure to launch the National Guard in time. And I believe that delay came from the top. And I believe that what we really need to do is address the breakdown in democracy, essentially. But I I think that I'm strongly opposed to the authorization of that new force. The Federal Bureau of Prisons requested funding as well, and there was some allocation for facial recognition technology, which I am also strongly opposed to on many different grounds. One, the technology is not reliable. Two, it disproportionately targets, its algorithms disproportionately target people of color, and say that and identify people of color as criminals when they are not. And, the bias of the programming of the programmer goes into the programming, even if that bias is subconscious. And so I'm strongly opposed to facial recognition technology. And for the intents of, for the purposes of that, of those allocations, I knew that I could not vote for this bill. I could not vote for it. And, I think the decision and going between voting no and voting present was one that a lot of us were really struggling with up until literally the very last minute. And so it was one that was very difficult because I don't want to deny people the overtime that they've worked. I don't want to deny people the mental health care that their existing employment arrangement does not provide for. And so that is kind of where we had landed there. But if you believe that I should have voted differently on that, I strongly encourage you to call our office and to let us know, because sometimes we get into these votes that happen, that these votes kind of get called and they fall into a very intense situation, and you have to make a decision in a matter of hours or sometimes minutes. And so, providing your feedback is quite helpful, because if you preferred that I had not voted that way, it's important for you to let us know. I won't take it personally. It was a really tough vote, and I can use your feedback in the future if a similar situation arises.
Thank you. Maria from Jackson Heights asks, are you going to do anything about rolling back the filibuster?
Well, we're doing a lot, and I think it's something that's really important. So for those of you who may not know, the filibuster is in the Senate. I serve in the House. The filibuster is an arcane rule that exists in the Senate. It was literally created by accident. The filibuster was not created. It was not authored. It wasn't designed and someone said, we need a filibuster. We're going to create a filibuster. It's in the Senate rules. The filibuster is actually something that was created through a loophole by an absence of rules. And the story of how the filibuster was created is pretty crazy. Basically, the House and the Senate had the same rules back in the 1800s. And the Senate rules, though, were very convoluted, the Senate rule book. So there was a movement to just retranscribe the Senate rule book so that it was more streamlined, but not change any of the rules. Now, what had happened was that when they were retranscribing the Senate rule book, they literally just forgot or just dropped the ball in transcribing one rule. I believe it was on the previous question, but maybe Miriam can correct me on that. And as a result, the absence of that rule that we have in the House is what created this window to do something known as the filibuster, which is require a 60 vote threshold to pass any major piece of legislation that is super important, like, for example, voting rights. And in order for us to really pass major legislation, immigration reform, voting rights, etc., we need to abolish the filibuster. Now, the reason the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow is because this absence, this use of the filibuster in this loophole kind of went completely unnoticed. No one really did it until people started to challenge Jim Crow laws on the federal level. And from there, the filibuster and this loophole became the favored ideal of segregationists, or rather the favored tool of segregationists to block civil rights legislation from passing and being signed into law. And so what can we do about the filibuster? We need to get every single Democrat on the record in the Senate on their position on the filibuster. There is a shockingly large amount that will not commit to their stance on the filibuster. And we have to make sure that we're lobbying not just Republicans. They're kind of a lost cause in some ways, some of them especially, but Democrats, because a lot of this issue are Democrats that have this like romanticized ideal of, or idea of what the filibuster is, what its importance is, et cetera. I mean, there are literally members of the Senate, hello, state of Arizona. There are senators from Arizona who issue ridiculous statements talking about like the completely false, advancing very false notions that the filibuster was intentional or it was like some grand compromise or design. All of that is a fantasy. And it is so, I cannot state enough how much the health of our democracy is on the line with this, because with all of the voter suppression laws that are sweeping in Republican-led states across the country, we have to pass H.R. 1. We do not pass H.R. 1 until Democratic senators get their act together and abolish the filibuster. And we're running out of time. So we have been very vocal about it, but we need to put a lot more political pressure on these Democrats in the Senate that are dragging their feet on filibuster reform, because I mean, I'm very concerned that they are failing to appreciate how delicate this political moment is. And, if you think Trump was an aberration and if you think that he was just a one-off and nothing like that can ever happen again, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the evidence is all around us. And I feel like at this point, it's a delusion to think that Trump was just this accident instead of a symptom of something much deeper that's defining the Republican Party. And they not only will they take away our democracy, they are. Just look at what's happening in Republican states across the country.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And you were correct that it was the previous question. And I can speak for all of us when I say we always appreciate the context to a lot of these very technical legislative processes that just don't have to be that way. So John from Parkchester asks or says, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez speaks of the Green New Deal. As a master electrician, I've researched this, and I'm curious how she proposes to meet the electrical demand on the current grid, since green energy will increase the electrical load by 325%.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, John. I can definitely tell you that your expertise is going to be very much needed moving forward. The short answer to your question is that we can't. We cannot convert to 100% renewable energy with our current grid. That is why we propose a dramatic expansion and investment in our national grid, because we have to make sure that we make those grid investments so that this electricity that we generate not only has a place to go and not only has a more secure and stable national grid to go, but that also that it has a place that can be stored. So for folks who don't know, because why would somebody randomly know how our national electric grid works? Our flow of electricity and our flow of power, when it comes to our grid, when you flick on that light switch, it's almost like a constant stream, right? It's a constant stream of power, but it's not really the way that power is stored. it really depends on the source of where that power is coming from. And so if you're kind of coming from fossil fuels or gasoline, that energy in a way is stored in the mass of that gas before it's burned, or or that coal, etc. But when it comes to something like solar power, you have the sun coming in, and unless that energy is being directly transformed and used to turn on your light, which very often it is, and it can be, if there's any energy beyond that, it needs to be stored. And so what we plan to do when we talk about the Green New Deal is that is in tandem with massive, massive investments in our national grid so that it can accommodate the transition to renewable energy, but also with major investments in battery storage technology. Many of us here in the district have family in Puerto Rico, myself included. And what we see, especially in the aftermath of disasters, is that when these grids break down, or when you look at what happened in Texas, for example, when these grids break down, those connections in the grid get cut, and that leads to mass power outages. Battery storage is a way that you can localize storage of electricity so that those outages aren't as bad and they don't impact tens and tens of thousands of people at once potentially. Or you could even potentially have battery storage for your own house, so that in an emergency, that battery can kick on, especially if you have someone like my grandmother, for example, is a homebound senior, if she has an oxygen machine, etc. If your power goes out and you have really critical appliances like that need to be run, battery storage can help be a solution in that as we transition to renewables as well. But there's so many things that we need to do, and we're going to need folks like the electrical workers and our union and labor to be at the front in defining the solutions for that, as well as ensuring that the jobs that are created in that transition are high-paying, dignified union jobs. That's one thing that we've really been diving into and looking at as well. We're not going to accept $30,000, $40,000 jobs for electrical workers in this transition. No way. We need to make sure that we pump up those salaries and those incomes so that they are dignified and worthy of a living wage.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Richard from the Bronx asks, although Trump's tax plan provided higher standard deductions, it really hurt New York homeowners who itemized their deductions and used the state and local tax deduction, or SALT, in prior years to lower their taxes. Since you have a good number of homeowners in your district, will you be working to bring back SALT?
So this is a great question. So SALT, let's talk about SALT. This is a big deal. There was recently a delegation-wide letter that went out asking for the full repeal of this change in SALT. Most members of the delegation signed it. I did not, but that doesn't mean that it's like the don't panic is what I'm trying to tell you. Don't panic. Here's the deal: is that SALT, when you actually kind of break down who applies for SALT, 100% repeal of SALT ends up being a benefit for the very, very, very wealthiest people. Now, if you use SALT, I'm not saying you're wealthy. I'm not saying you shouldn't get relief. Don't worry. What I'm talking about is full repeal. So that means allowing SALT to be repealed for everybody, including Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and billionaires and people with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to claim SALT deductions. I think everyday working people, normal homeowners in our district should benefit and should not get slammed with this change in SALT. But what we find when you actually break down the numbers is that those folks are actually not folks like you are not the majority of the dollars that come in from that change in SALT. So where I'm at in this is that I say, Let's keep it for the Jeff Bezoses of the world, of the super, super, super high net worth people who are not paying enough in taxes to begin with. And let's fix the situation for people like you and other homeowners in our district that are, you have like two normal incomes, especially in a city like New York City, that don't go as far here as they go in maybe a more rural part of the country. Someone in a more rural part of the country may look at a salary here and say, wow, you guys are wealthy. And we're here. And we know that it doesn't go nearly as far. And that goes across many different income levels. So where my position currently is that I think that SALT repeal can, and I'm open to SALT repeal, to having that SALT repeal applied to normal middle-class homeowners in our community, but I don't believe in repealing it for the ultra high net worth individuals that, frankly, the bulk of that SALT money applies to a lot of those folks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So thank you so much for the residents for asking your questions. You can always contact our office by calling 718-662-5970. And so next we'll be moving over to the press gaggle. If you are a reporter and would like to ask a question, please click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and state your name and outlet in the question field. Reporters who are selected will be unmuted so they can ask their question to the member directly. The first question is coming from Kevin Frey from New York One.
Hi, Congresswoman. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Thanks for doing this, as always. I had two quick questions for you. One, I don't know if you want to comment on this because it's a congressional Zoom, but do you have any position in the mayor's race, and are you being courted by any of these candidates at this point? I imagine you are. And then I'm curious what you make of the $1.7 billion, or trillion rather, counter proposal from the White House on infrastructure. Would you even be willing to go that low as the negotiations get going?
So I'll start with your second question. No, I don't think we should go this low. I think that we need to make very dramatic investments as quickly as possible. And 1.7, I mean, for legislation, as I mentioned earlier, the Republican Party has already shown a pattern of the fact that their vote can't even be counted on. So they engage in this pattern, as we've seen with legislation, for example, the January 6th Commission, where they issue all of these demands and they say, you need to go lower, you need to do less, you have to, meet our demands. And then when some Democrats who in good faith try to accommodate in order to earn their support, that legislation comes to the floor, and then they will end up pulling their support at the last minute anyway. So I don't believe that they have proven themselves to be a reliable and dependable enough legislative partner to be in the position to be making any demands of the Biden administration. Maybe when they can actually contribute and vote for legislation that they impose demands on, we can actually talk about them issuing larger demands on legislation that will be defining our infrastructure for the next 10 years. But I do not believe that the Biden administration should be doing this. I think it is, they have a history of doing this. It's manipulative. It's their way of trying to bring down investments in communities. And by the way, these cuts almost always disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. They impact communities of color, they impact rural communities, they impact low-income communities, and a lot of times they impact democratic, deep democratic communities and districts. And so, to sacrifice all of that when in the end they have a pattern of not even voting for it anyway, you're not even picking up their vote. And so I don't think that I don't think that their behavior has merited or deserves or puts themselves in a position of making demands. When they actually want to participate in good faith in our legislative process, then maybe we can discuss that. But so far, especially in this session, they haven't. And I think the January 6th Commission vote was a perfect example of that. They issued all these demands. Democrats engaged in good faith. They changed the legislation in ways that even I disagreed with in order to gain Republican votes, and even the head of the caucus in the end turned his back on the deal. And so I think that so on that, and then on the mayoral, again, this is an official congressional town hall. But I think that what I can say is that we're looking at engaging on city level and city council races quite soon.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Katie from the New York Times.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you for taking my question. So you talked tonight about the importance of thinking about public safety in comprehensive terms beyond matters of policing. And I promise that this isn't actually a question about the mayor's race, but I will note that we have seen in the mayor's race so far a lot of polling that suggests that crime is a top issue for Democratic voters right now. The current two leading candidates talk often about proposals like adding more police to the subways. And I just wonder if you worry about the mood of the party in New York on this issue and what you're seeing on the ground on this issue in your district.
Yeah, I think, again, the thing that's really important is that, of course, we should all be concerned and all really examine some of the root causes of violence. And it's really important that we address it. Now, what I think is really important is that we use very strong evidence-based approaches to addressing and dismantling and bringing down the incidence of violence in communities. And by evidence-based, I don't just mean correlative, and I don't just mean trends. I mean investing in solutions that have been clinically shown to reduce incidence of crime. And so while I think it's really important that we talk about this issue, I think that we have to end this reflexive, or rather this very impulsive reflex of just saying, where there's crime, add police, don't really have any other plan beyond that, and make a wish that that's going to change things. We know that doesn't work. And so if the knee-jerk reaction to every time someone sees an elevated incidence of crime is to just pour money into policing, I really question how much that person has really thoroughly looked at the data and thought about this issue and how comprehensive their response is. Because if the only element that a person discusses when it comes to public safety is police, I think that their scope is woefully narrow in solving this issue. As I mentioned, here at Jacoby, and along with many other issues, like, for example, addressing housing instability, is an extremely effective approach. Again, looking at things like stand up to violence, we see that when we address root causes of violence, when you actually dig into what precipitated the incident, when you examine housing, employment status, and when you bring in actual psychological care, we see dramatic reductions in recidivism and in repeat levels of crime and offenses. And one thing that I think is really important is that we see, as these COVID restrictions get lifted, we are seeing certain upticks in violent crime, shootings, etc. That's, if anything, it only adds to the urgency for people to stop looking at this from a knee-jerk, if everything, if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And if elected officials are only looking at public safety through the lens of policing, they are not going to make their community safer. I mean, that's just the fact. There was this resistance to the idea of having mental health first responders when a huge percentage of individuals who are incarcerated are shown to have issues with mental health. I mean, housing and mental health are huge aspects, and lack of health care, etc. I mean, if we don't have first responders that are capable of addressing the actual drivers of the instability that contribute to violence, I mean, I don't see how a leader can navigate a city to safety if the only tool or the first tool that they reach for is policing, and they aren't doing anything to really dramatically shift housing, employment, mental health care, overall health care, etc.
Great, thank you. And that is all the questions from the press. And so thank you so much to our residents for joining us. Your engagement is what allows us to continue to fight for you in Congress. And so again, you can always contact our office by calling 718-662-5970. And have a good evening, everyone.
And we're serious. Call me, call the office, please. Tell us what you think. Bye.